You know, I sent Kyle after what I said was my notes that I was pretty certain that I printed and sitting in the tray of my printer. But now I'm not even so sure I hit the print button. So he may. Oh no, I told him right where they'd be if they're there. So, and he's not back. So I'll bet you. I don't know. Is it going to get worse? That's always good to know. Oh, he's got some papers in his hand. Were they in the tray? Not as bad as I thought. Not as bad as I thought. Thank you, sir. And these were the kind of notes. These were the kind of notes where I knew I couldn't do this without my notes. There's just so much material in here. Whereas this one right here I can do without notes. Tyler's back with us tonight, and we're so grateful to see him. Appreciate him being with us on Sunday nights. And he was talking about he got a book on how to study the Bible, and there's a number of really good books out there that help us, that give us overviews of the Bible, explain to us different types of literature in the Bible, poetry, prophecy, etc. The chronological orders of the Bible and all the historical background. So there's a lot of good stuff out there to be had. And then he said, I got up to some Seventh-day Adventists, and they gave me this. I said, give me that. It says, top 10 reasons for keeping the Sabbath. And so I thought, well, you know what? I'm just going to look at this thing, and while Kyle's running to get my other notes, so we'll just run through this real quick because the Sabbath day still seems to be a problem for so many people, and so this just I looked through this. It's just incredible. Here's reason number 10: you keep the Sabbath because the Bible calls the seventh day of the week the Sabbath. That's supposedly a reason to keep the Sabbath, because the Bible calls the seventh day of the week the Sabbath. I mean, that's like saying, well, we need to keep the Passover because the Bible calls the Passover the Passover. I mean, that's about how much sense that makes. So we're not going to do that. All right. Reason number 9: the seventh day Sabbath dates from the creation week. That is. If I was Facebook and I was fact checking this, I'd say this needs some more information. There's missing context. I used to get that a lot on my Facebook posts. This is missing context. All right? And so it is true that the first mention of the Sabbath is found in the creation account, found in the creation week. Genesis chapter 2, after God made everything in 6 days, which is, by the way, something that I had already planned to talk about tonight, the 6 days of creation. It says that God rested on the seventh day, and God hallowed the seventh day and blessed it. Now, one thing that has to be remembered is, who wrote that? Who wrote that? Moses wrote it. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. He did not write the end of Deuteronomy because he was dead at the end. All right, so obviously there's a chapter or so at the very end of Deuteronomy that he did not write, that in all likelihood Joshua wrote it or had it written, okay? And so Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Moses lived about 2,500 years after those events occurred in Genesis chapter 1. And so Moses is writing from a perspective that's 2,500 years removed from the creation. And there's nothing that says that God hallowed the Sabbath then. That he hallowed the Sabbath then. And in fact, all the information about the Sabbath that we know is that God did not hallow the Sabbath until Exodus, until the book of Exodus, which again was over 2,000 years removed from the creation. Nobody on record from Genesis 1 to Exodus 13, 2,500 years. or at least 2,000 years. Nobody is on record as ever observing the Sabbath. Adam never kept the Sabbath, at least there's no record that Adam ever observed the Sabbath. There's no record that Noah ever observed the Sabbath. There's no record that Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob ever observed the Sabbath. Now, it seems to me that if the Sabbath day was as important in the overall scheme of human history that the Sabbatarians make it, that we'd have some reference to, Abraham, of all people, should have been a Sabbath keeper, right? And yet there's not one word anywhere in the Scriptures that anybody ever observed the Sabbath until God instituted the Passover and gave the Ten Commandments in Exodus 13 and then the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20. All right? That's the first command to observe the Sabbath, is in Exodus 20. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. All right? Now, the book of Deuteronomy is Moses' final discourse to the Israelites before he died and before they entered into the land of Canaan. Moses reiterated the original law. In other words, it was given before the wilderness wandering. But then, of course, and it was also given before they really messed up and didn't go into the land of Canaan. So it was given immediately after leaving Egypt. It was given for them to go into the promised land and observe that law. They messed up. They wouldn't go in. They wandered in the wilderness 40 years. Everybody from the age of 20 and up, except for the households of Joshua and Caleb, died in the wilderness from 20 years old and up. So here's a bunch of people fixing to enter the promised land who have not been formally introduced to the law that's going to govern them. So Moses gives the law again. That's why it's called Deuteronomy. The first part of that word means two, and onomy means law. And so it's the second giving of the law. And in Deuteronomy 5, beginning in verse 1, Moses says, this law, which includes the Ten Commandments, which he's about to restate the Ten Commandments, was not given to our fathers. In other words, it wasn't given to Abraham, it wasn't given to Adam, it wasn't given to Noah, it wasn't given to Abraham or Isaac or Jacob, it wasn't given to any of these people, it wasn't given to Joseph. It says, it was given to us, those of us who are alive here this day. And then in about verse 13, in Deuteronomy 5, about verse 13 and following, the Ten Commandments are given, and the command to observe the Sabbath is restated. But then it's explained. Now in Exodus it says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. In 6 days you shall do your work, and the seventh day you shall do no work. That's pretty much the extent of the explanation. Deuteronomy, Moses goes back and says, here's why you keep the Sabbath. In other words, here's the explanation for keeping the Sabbath. In order that you might remember that you were slaves in Egypt and had no rest. In other words, the Egyptians made the Jews work 7 days a week. There was no such thing as a day off for a slave. They worked 7 days a week. And so God gave them the Sabbath as a day of rest, not to work. It says, and when this is observed, you remember that you were slaves in Egypt. And then it says, therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath. Therefore, no, this is the reason you're to keep the Sabbath, to remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Now, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, none of those men were ever slaves in Egypt. Unless you want to take Joseph as a slave in Potiphar's house, but not as a people. They were not slaves. They were not slaves in Egypt. And so when God said, here's the thing. When God says this is the reason to keep the Sabbath, that's the reason to keep the Sabbath. To remember you were a slave. And so we have, even in the text itself, the reason the Sabbath was given. Also this. After the law of Moses was given, and particularly the Sabbath day, it says, they found a man outside gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. you know, probably to build a fire. And by the way, they were expressly forbidden to kindle a fire on the Sabbath day. So here's a man out gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And they took him into custody, and they didn't know what to do with him. You know why? Because they'd never had to deal with this problem before. You know why? Because they had never been commanded to observe the Sabbath before. So Moses says, put him in ward. In other words, put him in safekeeping. I'll go ask the Lord what to do with him. And the Lord said, you take him out and stone him to death. Take him out and stone him to death. But isn't it interesting that if the Sabbath had been supposedly observed for 2,500 years, that people would have known what to do with a man violating? Was this the first guy in 3,000 years to violate the Sabbath? No. He was the first man in about 3 months. First man in about 3 months to violate the Sabbath. And so just the very nature of the Sabbath itself. So yes, the Sabbath is given in view of the creation week, but nobody was ever commanded to observe it until the giving of the law of Moses. Then reason number 8, the Sabbath is the fourth of the 10 commandments. That's why you keep it. The Sabbath is the fourth of the 10 commandments. To which I say, so? I mean, how many of the 10 commandments do we keep today?
Not any of the 10.
None of them. Thank you, Walter. Not a one. We don't keep any of the 10 commandments today. Why?
Well, in Colossians it says it's gone away.
In Colossians chapter 2 it says they're gone away, being nailed to the cross of Jesus Christ. Passage after passage after passage in the New Testament teach the nullification of the 10 commandments. Jesus took the old law of Moses, including the 10 commandments, and nailed it to the cross. We don't follow any of the law of Moses. Not one word of the law of Moses do we follow. One, because that law was nullified at the cross. Number two, because none of us are Jews. Again, the text itself says, Deuteronomy 5, the law of Moses was only given to Jewish people, and not one of you in this audience is a Jew. You're the biggest bunch of Gentiles I've ever seen in my whole life. Gentiles, every one of you. That's for the same reason that we don't keep the laws of... Why don't we observe the laws of Germany? Because I'm not a German. I'm an American. I observe the laws of America because I'm an American. And those laws are given to Americans, and they're not given to Germans. Germans don't observe our laws. We don't observe Germany's laws. By the way, is it possible that some of our laws are the same as the laws in Germany?
It's possible.
And probable and likely. But just because there may be some carryover in some of the laws here and some of the laws there, doesn't mean I'm following their laws. I'm following mine. I'm following the ones that are given to me. And so because I'm not a Jew, I don't keep the 10 commandments. By the way, even if the 10 commandments were still in effect today, I couldn't keep them. Unless I became a proselyte. Right? I'd have to become a proselyte, a Jewish convert, in order to keep the 10 commandments. And so just because it's the fourth of the 10 commandments doesn't amount to a hill of beans. Because all of the 10 commandments are done away with at the cross. Just to give you some more passages on this, Walter cited Colossians 2, and beginning verse 14. Actually, it goes even back a little bit further, maybe verse 13. Romans chapter 7 says the law that says thou shalt not covet is like a dead husband. And the only place in the law that says thou shalt not covet is the 10 commandments. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 7 through 18. That's my go-to passage. It says, the law written and engraved in stones has been done away with. Now, what part of the law was written and engraved in stone? Just the 10 commandments. So, in other words, Paul was specific about the 10 commandments being done away with, along with the rest of the law. And so, Romans 7, verses 1 to 7, 2 Corinthians 3, 7 through 18, Colossians 2, also Galatians 2, by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. Galatians 2, verse 16. And even in Galatians 3, did you receive the Holy Spirit through the works of the law or by the hearing of faith? You know, basically the whole book of Galatians is telling people, you're Christians, get away from the law of Moses. And the whole book of Hebrews is written to Christians, reminding them, don't go back to the law of Moses. It's no good. I mean, it's a faulty covenant. We noted that in our sermon this morning. If the first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for the second. And so the New Testament is God's perfect covenant with man, not the Old Testament, and certainly not the Ten Commandments. And then, you know, there are a number of other things here that are really not reasons either. You know, but the main reason that we don't keep the Sabbath day is because we're not Jews. The law of Moses has been done away with, and there is no commandment in the New Testament for Christians to observe the Sabbath. None. There's no commandment. You know, when did the early church gather? When did the early church? We studied this morning. First day of the week. Now, it did get one thing right. The Sabbath is the seventh day of the week. But if the early church gathered on the first day of the week, that's not the seventh day of the week. And so the early church is commanded to meet on Sunday, what we call Sunday, the first day of the week, as opposed to the Sabbath day or the seventh day, which we call in our language we call it Saturday. And so I'll give you this back, Tyler, whenever if you want it. But I mean, it ain't gonna do you no good. All right, so now finishing up from last week. You recall that I got a question from a lady in Tennessee about the matter of the Bible, and is the Bible concerned with truth? The Bible talks about dragons. The Bible talks about leviathans, unicorns, multi-headed beasts, miracles, magic, and we dealt with each one of those things. First of all, she confused, with the matter of dragons and leviathans, she confused the two, unless she was talking about the figurative reference of the devil being the dragon in Revelation 12. The Bible does talk about the Leviathan in Job 41. And the description of the Leviathan is the description of a dragon. What we would consider the legends of dragons. And we noted that in the United Kingdom and in Mesopotamia and in Africa, India, China, Japan, South America, Latin America, and in the state of Illinois in North America. All these cultures dating all the way back from the Sumerian culture, which is 5,500 years ago, to the Illini tribe in the state of Illinois, which was not 5,500 years ago. They all have what we call dragon legends, or called dragon myths, or dragon lore. And the consistency of the description of those animals is remarkable across the entire globe, even though these people had no way to communicate with one another. Even though they were separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, they all have similar dragon lore or legends. What I would say is they have dragon history. Because if I say lore or legend, I'm implying that it's nothing but a bunch of stories. But I believe it. And in the United States, we have depictions of them etched in stone. And there are, again, the Chinese dragon accounts go back also thousands of years. And the only explanation is those animals existed just like God said they did in Job 41. And so we make no apologies for the Leviathan. We noted that the word unicorns is just simply a terrible translation of the King James Version, and that just because a translation gives a bad rendering doesn't mean that the original is bad. Does that make sense? In other words, our New Testament, whether you're carrying a King James Version or a New King James Version or an English Standard Version or whatever it is that you might be reading from, They're all translated from a body of ancient literature. They're all from a body of ancient literature. And it's translated as best they can, supposedly, and that's generally the intent, translated from the ancient literature into the best language of the modern, or the best literature of the modern language. And so that's why our translations don't read exactly the same, because English words change meaning over time. That's why it's always good to have I think it's good to have a good modern translation. A lot of people don't like any translation but the King James. But my problem with the King James is kids are not being taught Elizabethan English anymore in school. My grandma Burleson and my grandpa Burleson were raised over here and went to school at Buttahatchee. Back in my grandpa probably started in about 1917. If he started when he was 6, he started school in 1917. My grandma would have started in the early 1920s, the early 1920s. Well, they taught Shakespeare. They taught Elizabethan English, in other words, Shakespeare-type language. Well, my grandma never had anything more than an 8th grade education, but she had grown up reading the King James and being taught in school, being taught those things. But I can assure you, my wife is a 6th grade English teacher. She's not teaching Shakespeare. You don't teach Shakespeare, do you? Tiny bit? Really? I figured they'd want to learn English first.
Not the whole story.
Not the whole story.
I mean, not the whole thing, but excerpts.
Okay, excerpts. All right, so kids are not being taught to read these types of things the way that they once were. So the language of the King James Version presents an artificial barrier to understanding. In other words, a modern translation can give the same meaning without the struggle of the old language. For example, Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 1, "We do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed upon the churches of Macedonia." Now, when's the last time you ever heard somebody say, "We do you to wit"? We do you to wit. All right? The word wit means your mind. If somebody is witty, that means they have a sharp mind. What Paul's saying is, we want you to know. But the language then said, "We do you to wit." How about this one? You're not constrained by us, you're constrained by your own bowels. That's what it says. In 2 Corinthians, you are constrained in or by your own bowels. Now, I know what most of us would think if we heard that we were constrained in our bowels. But the text is, you're being hindered by your own inward lust. The bowels were the seat of emotion. They consider that the seat or the center of your emotions. In other words, the feeling that you have in your stomach or in your heart, whatever. And so the modern translation says, you are being hindered by your own lusts or desires. And so just because a translation may not accurately render a thing in modern language doesn't mean that the original is bad. And so when you find the word unicorn, there's a word there, yeah. But unicorn is not a good rendering of it, because we all know no such thing as unicorn. And so in every instance of the New King James, instead where the King James uses the word unicorn about 9 times, in the New King James and other renderings, it says wild ox, a wild ox. And so it's just a bad translation. And so we understand those types of things. And but now moving on to some things that were not mentioned, that we didn't deal with last week. It says, why is it that when you see people rejecting the truth about science, current events, they are almost always religious? And so what I did was, first of all, I sent the lady everything that I had compiled last week and said, here's the material, all the things I said about dragons, leviathans, unicorns, miracles, etc. I sent her all my notes from last week, and I said, but I need some explanation on what are the scientific and current events that religious people reject, and I didn't hear back. And by the way, I sent it on Sunday, so there's been a full week to get this back. I have not received a response. What I suspect, now you understand what I'm saying, right? What I suspect she's talking about in regard to science would be things like climate change, or things like evolution, and things of that nature. Why is it that, in other words, she's claiming that these things are facts and anybody who rejects them has a tendency to be religious. Well, first of all, there's a problem with that premise. Number one, if last time I saw something along these lines, between 80 and 90% of all Americans claim some belief in God. Some belief in God. And the overwhelming majority of those people claim some form of Christianity. All right? So, asking that question, why is it that people who reject these scientific so-called facts are almost always religious, is like saying, why is it that everybody that has a car wreck seems to be a Christian? Why? Because the vast majority of all the people, and I'm using the term Christian loosely, you understand that, right? In the general sense. Because most people that live in America are Christians in the broadest sense of the term. So therefore, guess what? Most people that have car wrecks are going to be Christians. Most people that do anything are going to be Christians, except most people that are atheists. There's the exception to the rule. Most people that are atheists are not Christians. And so the very fact that almost all Americans are not only believers in God, but adherents to some form of Christianity makes this question itself inaccurate. All right? And so that's it's a bad comparison, because most Americans are Christians. But let's be clear. This idea of climate change is not settled science. Now, look, I know that all the major media news outlets, and they're trying to force it down our kids' throats in school. And I'm not talking about Marion County. I'm just talking about, because we're really blessed to have a lot of great teachers in this county that don't buy into all that foolishness. Okay, I'm not saying that none of them do. I'm just saying, as a general rule, most of our kids' teachers believe in God. Most of our kids' teachers believe in the Bible. They believe in some form of Christianity. So we're blessed in that respect, as opposed to many other places around the country. But this idea that climate change is settled science is foolishness. It's not settled at all. Just because all the media outlets scream about it, and just because all the universities scream about it, and just because a bunch of the politicians scream about it, that don't make it true. That make it true. By the way, I'm old enough to remember being taught in school that we were headed for another ice age. In 1972, 73, 74, 75, all of the scientists were telling us we're headed for another ice age. You could read about it in Reader's Digest. You could read about it in Newsweek. You could read about it in Time Magazine. You could read about it in Popular Mechanics. You could read about it in every science publication that came out. We are headed for an ice age. 10 years later, global warming. And you're going to tell me that this is settled science? That we went from an ice age to burn it up in 10 years. But if you deny climate change, you're supposedly anti-science, you're anti-truth, you're anti-facts. That ain't so. There are a ton of scientists who do not believe that foolishness. And by the way, James Spann came out, and I know, look, James Spann is almost, he's pretty high up there. James Spann came out and just basically poo-pooed this whole idea of global warming and climate change, and they like to ran him out on a rail. because the Weather Channel's not interested in hearing what an actual meteorologist has to say. You know, I'm pretty sure James Spann knows a little bit about weather. I mean, he knows where Aunt Sally's storm house is, you know, over there near Bug Tussle. But this guy knows a little bit about weather, and he says this is just not it's not right. And he's not the only one. And so this idea that all scientists believe in climate change is just foolishness. The only thing they know is that they don't know. And we do know this, that the climate of the world has run in cycles over extended periods of time. I mean, get this. Hundreds of years ago, there were vineyards in the United Kingdom, in England, Scotland, up there. They had vineyards in places that cannot grow grapes now. You know why? Too cold. Too cold. So that tells me 300 years ago, it was warmer than it is now. So it means what? That place is colder now than it was 300 years ago. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of places that are now desert that were not desert. I mean, it's just, by the way, I read this the other day. This just shows you how foolish this bunch is. Did you know that global warming also causes global cooling? That's right. Global warming causes global cooling. And so, if it gets hot, you know what's the cause? Global warming. If it gets cold, you know what the cause is? Global warming. If it's dry and a drought, you know what causes it? Global warming. But if you get too much rain, you know what causes it? Global warming. In other words, global warming causes all of it. Even the things that are the polar opposite of one another. Don't talk to me about dealing in facts when you want to propagate such foolishness as that. All right? Global warming is not a biblical matter, okay? Other than the fact that here's what we do know. Man does not have the ability to destroy this world. The Bible's clear. Only God has that ability. Now, do we need to be good stewards of our planet? Sure we do. It bothers me to go to Ghana and just look, the streets, the high, everywhere in Ghana is just all down the edge of the road is just lined with litter. It don't matter where you go. I'm talking about litter everywhere. I'm talking about just piles of litter. And I remember the first time I went to Ghana and we got in the van and we stopped and we got a bite to eat and we had these cardboard boxes, our chicken and fries and stuff were in and had Coke, had a can of Coke, whatever, and we're going down the road and I'm watching this guy from Ghana eat and he got done, just pitched the whole thing out the window. Box and all, can and all. And they all do that. They all do that. I don't think that's being a very good steward of the environment. But look, that's on them. I'm not going to do that. I think we need to take care of our natural resources. But you have to remember this. The earth was made for man and not man for the earth. Does that make sense? The earth was made for man and not man for the earth. And so, in other words, man has been given, what would we say, conservatorship of the earth, stewardship of the earth. And so there's just so much about this climate change. What was the other one I mentioned? Evolution. Evolution is, that is such terrible science. It's not even science. Science is the pursuit of facts. Things that can be observed or proven through observation and experimentation. Nobody has ever proved that man came from monkeys, all right? The idea, you've all seen the picture of the monkey with the monkey standing up a little bit more and the monkey standing up a little bit more and then the gorilla and then the man. It's called the ascent of man. That's purely the figment of one artist's imagination. There's not one particle of evidence that says that we came from monkeys. None. None. There's no evidence that says the earth is billions of years old. What I mean by evidence, there's no compelling evidence. There's no evidence that can be presented that says this cannot be refuted, and the only explanation is that the earth is billions and billions of years old. By the way, the earth has a severe aging problem. A severe aging problem. When Darwin published The Origin of the Species, the earth was about 20 million years old, according to Darwin. 20 million years old. 60 years later, the earth was 1.5 billion years old. Aging problem. When I was in school, the earth was 4.5 billion years old, less than 100 years later. And now, I've only been out of school 35 years, and now the earth is 15 or 20 billion years old.
The reason in Revelation continually states that is how they hide your lack of knowledge is by covering it up with eons of time.
They cover the gaps with eons of time. That's exactly right. Reason in Revelation is a publication of our brethren out of Apologetics Press in Montgomery. Great organization, sound in the faith. They produce scientific material for kids, adults, and that's what's it. They think that time helps them. They think that time helps them. And in fact, time does not help them.
In the Bible, it teaches that the seasons are going to be here as long as the earth exists.
That's true.
You say, I read it.
But here's the thing, Walter. You can't point to the Bible to tell somebody that doesn't believe the Bible that the earth is not billions of years old. You have to go other places. You remember the story I told you about Jamie Long? Being in Russia, and he met some guy on the street. He was going to try to study with him, and Jamie pulled his Bible out, and the Russian said, "So you got a book?"
That's why Brother Warren is so great.
Right. But the argument, the statement that he made, "So you got a book," meant I don't care what you say is in this book because I don't believe your book. And so you have to go to other places to show people that much of this theory is just foolishness. Then once you can do that, then you can go to the Bible. Look, most people in our area are professed Bible believers, right? I mean, they may not live by it at all, but they'll at least tell you that they believe in God and that they believe the Bible is the Word of God, even if they don't live by it. That number is decreasing as a general rule, but we have to be prepared to talk with people on other levels. And I tell y'all all the time, and I know Walter's not going to sit and watch YouTube videos all day. All right? Do you even know what YouTube is, Walter?
Yeah, barely.
Okay. All right. Walter barely knows what YouTube is. All right. But there is a wealth of information out there in the areas of apologetics that deal with the philosophical arguments against evolution. And William Lane Craig is one of my favorite apologists. He doesn't know everything. In fact, I'm going to tell you a couple things where he really gets it wrong. Frank Turek, Turek. Frank Turek is a great apologist. Bobby, I can't think of his name now. He's the 1 minute apologist, but I can't think of Bobby's last name. Ravi Zacharias has recently passed away. Robbie's got some great material out there to deal with people on a philosophical and scientific level without talking about the Bible with regard to evolution and whatnot. But here's what Craig. I was watching Craig today, as a matter of fact. Bobby Conway. Did you look that up? Bobby Conway, the 1 minute apologist. Great little snippets. And by the way, you don't have to sit for hours and watch these guys. They all have, like Craig has his own. His videos might be anywhere from 3.5 to 5.5 minutes long, 7 minutes long, 8 minutes long. Of course, Bobby Conway is the 1 minute apologist. They're rarely ever as short as 1 minute, but you don't have to invest 30, 40, 50 minutes, 2 hours at a time in these. You can get snippets and along the way. And I was watching Craig, he was talking about, somebody had asked him, said, what are the questions that evolution cannot answer? And he said, well, one of the questions is the origin of life. Evolution cannot answer the origin of life. Because evolution starts with something, right? And if you're going to start with something, there has to be a cause behind that something. And so evolution can't, and then you got guys like Stephen Hawking, who, without question, one of the most brilliant men who ever lived, who finally just said, you know what? Everything came out of nothing. Said that in 2010. Everything just came out of nothing. That's how it all started. A bunch of nothing gathered itself together and made something. That's what he said. That's the summation of what he said. A bunch of nothing gathered itself together and came up with something. Now, does that sound like science? No, that's not science. Look, it takes a whole lot more faith to believe that than to believe what I believe. All right? And so, but Craig was talking about a book called the Anthropic Cosmological Principle. Now, anthropic means man. Cosmological means cause and effect. And a book by, I think I read it down, Barrow and Tipler. And they laid down 10 things that were problematic for evolution as an explanatory process to explain life. And said, any one of these 10 things is almost insurmountable. Just from a pure statistical probability. Any one of these things. He says, but all 10 of them is a statistical impossibility. He said, if you could even have enough time to make, and here's the thing, he said, the development of photosynthesis, the development of mitochondria, the development of endoskeletons as opposed to exoskeletons. These are 3 of the 10 things. Said any one of these is problematic for evolution just on a pure time scale. Said, but all 10 of them are so problematic, said, that the sun would have way past burned itself up. Way past burned itself up and exploded and destroyed everything in the solar system. In other words, the mathematical principles are so overwhelming in any one point, then in any 10 of them combined is just, again, it's just a statistical impossibility. And then Craig made this statement. He said, natural selection and random mutations occur so slowly, that even if you gave it 4.8 billion years, you still couldn't create the complexity that exists in the world today. And by the way, Craig is an old Earth advocate. He believes the Earth is 4.8 billion years. He believes it, and he believes a lot of the stuff about evolution. But here's what he says. Even though I find the idea of common ancestry somewhat powerful, he says, the mechanism won't work. In other words, random mutations and natural selection is not sufficient to explain what we see. He says, how in the world can random mutations and natural selection explain how a bat and a sponge have a common ancestor? In other words, he says the mechanism won't work. He said, and there's no theory out there that even remotely begins to explain adequately a mechanism for the diversity of life that now exists. He says the only reasonable explanation is divine, a miraculous divine intervention. Now, my problem with Craig's argument is several-fold. Number one, because Craig does seem to believe that man is the descendant of primates, monkeys. My problem with that is, when did man become man and get a soul? At what point did we get just enough evolution to that one of them doesn't have a soul, and one of them does, and Jesus died for this one because this one has the ability to sin, but this one does not. And why are there still monkeys? And where did and by the way, if these things happened over millions of years and billions of years, every step should still be present. In other words, every change should be present in nature. You know, if this group of monkeys changed into this group, there's no reason for this group not to still exist. So then the next group has to exist, and then the next group, and every minute change should be present, alive right now. But obviously they're not. Not only that, there's no evidence of, there'd have to be what? Thousands or millions of changes to get a person out of a monkey? You know what I'm saying? I mean, there have to be millions of changes, at every single level in order to get a man out of a monkey. And where's the fossil evidence for that? It doesn't exist. And so I just have so many problems with like I said, Craig is an incredible apologist when it comes to the philosophical arguments about the existence of God. When it comes to the Bible, he's just not that good. All right? And by the way, he will tell you, I'm a layman when it comes to the Bible. Okay? I mean, it's not like he claims to be some kind of Bible scholar or whatnot. I heard him, and he was talking about, I heard him say this. He said, I believe Genesis chapter 1 is figurative language and is in no way intended to be understood in a literal fashion. All right? So obviously he's a denier of the 6-day creation. But one of the explanations that he gave was, he says, in Genesis 1 it says that trees and grass sprang up out of the earth. He said, did that happen just like, I don't know if you use a claymation or, you know what claymation is, right? The old cartoons, they make things out of clay and they reshape them. He goes, did that tree just grow up out of the earth in just a few moments' time that the tree grew up and was mature? He said, how in the world would you think that? How in the world do you think that when the Bible says the earth sprang forth with trees, did trees just grow up immediately? In the back of my mind, I'm going, yes! That's exactly how it happened. But he said, I just don't see how that can be possible. He said, when it says it sprang out, it doesn't mean immediately. So then I did a little research. And that same word that describes what happened with the trees and the grass is the exact same word to describe what happened when Moses brought frogs on the land of Egypt. It says they sprang out of the Nile River. And the land was literally, that's a nightmare for my wife now. I'm telling you. If my wife needed to repent, she would have repented on the night of the frogs. She'd rather deal with snakes, anything, than frogs. That's the look. She could run a marathon if you was behind her with a frog. All right? But the text says that frogs sprang forth out of the river and covered the land of Egypt. Now, let me ask you a question. Did it take millions of years for that to happen?
No.
Or did the frogs spring out just like Moses said they did? In a very short amount of time. And so, it just seems odd to me that I would ask, well, do you believe that Moses brought frogs out of the Nile River and it covered the land of Egypt in a single day? Or did it take millions of years to do that? Because that's the same word that, the same guy that wrote Exodus is the same guy that wrote Genesis. And he used the same language. And another thing I would say is this. If the creation account was not 6 days, the phrase in the beginning means nothing. Right? The phrase in the beginning in the Bible means nothing. Now, I know that doesn't mean anything to an evolutionist, all right? But I'm saying for people who claim to be Bible believers, who want to believe in an ancient earth, in the beginning has to mean something. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And, the second day and the third day. Well, when Jesus was talking about the devil, he said the devil was a liar and a murderer from the beginning. John chapter 8. How about Matthew 19? He that made them at the beginning made them male and female. And so for a Bible believer to try to accept this concept of macroevolution and the ascent of man makes so many parts of the Bible mean absolutely nothing. And yet Jesus used those terms specifically. And by the way, and here's the thing, William Lane Craig believes with every fiber of his being that Jesus Christ was a real person. He lived a perfect life. He died, he was buried, and he was raised from the dead the third day. And he can make a very compelling argument for that. But then there are other aspects of his faith that just seem so flimsy. In other words, I'm like, how can a guy as smart as you obviously are make such a bad argument to support your lack of faith in the Genesis account?
How did they get to that point? You believe God created everything. You have to believe He spoke it into existence, because there would have been nothing to work with.
Yeah, because the text, Hebrews 11 says, by faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God.
If you can believe that He spoke it into existence, I don't see how you have the trouble understanding
Yeah.
that.
If God set it all in motion, how come He couldn't do it the way He said that He did in Genesis chapter 1? Yeah, I know. Kyle, don't get it, man. It's just a head scratcher for me. And I'll give you one more example of Craig, just in case you have enough gumption to go look him up. Craig was debating Christopher Hitchens, an ardent anti-theist. I mean, he was an atheist of the worst sort. Just a real jerk, as a general rule, at least in his public demeanor. And he was arguing about the superiority of Christianity, because one thing Hitchens says, well, even if God exists, how do I know that Christianity is better than Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism or any number of these other religions? And rather than appeal to the Bible, Craig says the greatest testimony to the validity of the Christian religion is the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. In other words, what you feel in your heart. I mean, the guy just spent 2 hours trying to convince the world that God exists and that Jesus Christ is His Son, and that Christianity is the only true system of religion ordained by God. And he says, but the greatest testimony is what you feel in your heart. I'm like, dude, you just gave the whole thing away. You spent 2 hours building a magnificent palace of faith, and you just blew the whole thing to smithereens in one small sentence. Like I said, Craig's brilliant. He's a million times smarter than I am. But just because he's extremely intelligent doesn't mean that his arguments are always sound. All right? But from the philosophical perspective, and by the way, and I think I mentioned this last week, Craig will never tell you that he can prove that God exists. He says all the evidence points in that direction. And people will say the existence of God can neither be proven nor disproven. And there's a sense in which that's true. I mean, there's no empirical evidence that says, there is a God and I can show Him to you empirically speaking. But what Craig says is, gathering all the evidence, the logical and reasonable conclusion is, given what we see before us, is that there has to be a divine creator.
And I am an empirical being. I exist. I am here.
That's right. Yeah, I can prove that you exist.
Yes.
I can prove that you exist. And so when we say I know that God exists, what we're saying is I take all the evidence to be that God exists. That's the reasonable conclusion. And I can defend with reason, with rationality, why I believe that God exists.
That's how you come to the conclusion of anything.
That's right. You gather the evidence and draw a conclusion. And there's no evidence that man came from monkeys. There's no evidence, there's no evidence that says, like he said, that a bat is related to a sponge. And I thought that was,
Related to a virus.
or a bat's related to a virus. It's true. We won't go into that. But in any event,
The heart can deceive you.
boy, yeah, the heart is deceptive. I don't have time to do this. I'm already over time, but I just made a list, gathered up a list of great scientists who are all ardent Bible believers. Some of the greatest minds in all of science, some of the people who made the greatest discoveries in science and biology and astronomy, chemistry, physics, electricity, all Bible believers, all of them Bible believers. And I found this little, and I'll stop with this, and it says, between 1901 and 2000, over 65% of all Nobel Prize winners have identified Christianity as their religious preference. Over 65% of all Nobel Prize winners. And that includes this. 72% of all Nobel Prize winners in chemistry are Christians, or profess Christianity. 65% of all Nobel Prize winners in physics profess Christianity. 62% of all Nobel Prize winners in the area of medicine are all professed Christians. Now, what does that tell you? The world will tell you that no real scientist believes in God or believes in the Bible. But what does the evidence say? The evidence says that the scientists are wrong. That the media is wrong. All right? And so that's until I hear back from this person. That's the best I'm going to be able to do. The last part of her question. All right, I went way over time, but no apologies. I'll give it back to you one of these days.